Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello, and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about the pandemic's effect on farming and the food industry, and in particular, the grain industry, and what the long-term impacts may be. And we'll also discuss food economics and grain's journey from farm to table. My guest today is Christine Cochran. She is the executive director of the Grain Foods Foundation. She was a lover of grains before joining the foundation, and now she is an educated lover of grains. Welcome to the show, Christine.
Hi, thank you for having me, Melissa.
My pleasure. Christine, I understand that you got a BS in agricultural economics from the University of Missouri.
I did. Go Mizzou.
Yay! I got my master's at Mizzou. That's so awesome. What years were you there?
I was there from 1994 to 98.
We just missed each other. I graduated in 93 with my graduate degree. Oh, and you also have your JD, your Juris Doctorate from Georgetown, which is very impressive. And I'm really interested in your background in ag econ coupled with your law degree. And we're going to talk a little bit about your background. So I'd love for you to share some more about your background and your role at the Grain Foods Foundation, and also about the Grain Foods Foundation itself.
Well, of course. So when I was at the University of Missouri, I really fell in love with agricultural economics. My grandfather was an active farmer at the time. I spent a lot of time there, but my parents were not into farming. My father was a journalist and my mother was a librarian. But once I made it to campus, I really just connected with the subject matter. And while I was there studying agricultural economics, I had the opportunity to really travel the world and study agriculture, not only in the US, but globally. I spent some time in the Czech Republic, Costa Rica, and in Nigeria as well, all before heading off to law school. So really have a passion for agriculture and what it does, not just for us here in the United States, but for the world globally. And I was really excited to bring that to the foundation because much like your podcast, GFF is an organization that seeks to raise awareness of facts over fiction about grain foods through scientific research and resources. But we're also out on social media platforms and other forms of mainstream media as well, doing some of that myth busting. So, at the foundation, I've been able to marry that background in ag economics and commodity markets. So, when the pandemic hit for me, it was a real moment of learning and interest and curiosity. But I'm also a mom. So I was balancing 3 kids, working from home, homeschooling, and suddenly feeding everybody 3 times a day plus snacks. So, it's been a very real intellectual experience for me, but also a very real lived experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned earlier, we're really going to focus on the pandemic's effect on farming, food industry, and the grain industry. But I wanted to mention briefly, pre-pandemic, if you will, the Grain Foods Foundation has really been focusing on setting the record straight on some of the grain myths, maybe stemming back from the Atkins diet and then more currently, wheat belly, grain brain, and things like that. So I'd love for you to just briefly address, any of that low carb craze information, because I think that is maybe at the core of some of the issues that you have to address, the myths and misperceptions.
The low carb diets and just low carb curiosity, it dates back to the 1940s. So these questions that we are asking today, we've been asking for a very long time. And it's our job at the foundation to do our best to answer them. And as you said, bust the myths that persist out there. And I think one of the things that's always really striking to understand is just the role of wheat around the world. So while a lot of the low carb language focuses on the fact that we don't need wheat in the diet, and there are arguments that are made about our bodies not adapting to it and things like that, the overwhelming evidence is just to the contrary. 20% of all the calories consumed by humans, so around the globe, come from wheat. And that's a statistic by the United Nations, so not the Grain Foods Foundation. So it really is the basis of the diet for the vast majority of people. And it has been for centuries. And I think one of the things people underestimate is the nutritional value that's there. So whether it's your macronutrients like the carbohydrates that fuel your brain, the fiber that helps your gut health and helps you feel fuller longer, or the micronutrients like folic acid that really protect you. Wheat has so much to offer. Its nutrient density is almost unparalleled. It's very close to a glass of milk in terms of its nutrient density. And that's why when we eat it 6 times a day, it really can be the foundation for a healthy diet.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So you've been with the Grain Foods Foundation for how long now?
8 years.
Okay.
Prior to coming to GFF, I worked for a group called the Commodity Markets Council. And at that organization, we were an advocate on behalf of commodity traders. So the people who work out of Chicago or New York, really buying and selling barges of grain. So whether it was wheat or soybeans or corn, deeply involved in international trade issues. So getting it from point A to point B, infrastructure issues, like making sure the St. Lawrence Seaway was working, to the prices being traded in Chicago and New York.
Oh, very interesting. So you've got this background and interest in global agriculture, and then you have this background with the Commodity Markets Council, and then your work at the Grain Foods Foundation. What have you seen over your career that's maybe been the biggest shift or the biggest news that you'd like to share with us?
Well, in terms of news, for me, I think about it from 1998 to today. Okay. And one of the things that has really changed is people's interest in where their food comes from. And that dovetails with the trend of declining families on farms. So as more and more generations moved further and further away from the farm, what we found is somewhere between, 2000 and today, people became really interested in where their food came from because they no longer were as connected to it. And so I think that's just created an incredible discussion. Some might say debate, but I would say discussion and opportunity to learn more and for feedback. I think one of the things producers are learning is that their customer isn't necessarily the silo, right? Or the mill or, whomever they were dealing with on a B2B level, but rather it's that ultimate consumer. And that if you can get them to dialogue together, there's a lot of learning and it speeds up the feedback for the producers. And we see this most pronounced in environmental practices.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, before people were more interested in where their food comes from, there was like a huge disconnect there. So it is great to see that connection and that conversation going on. So let's get back to the pandemic's effect on the food industry and farming. What are some of the biggest things that you've observed? Here we are. It's July now. This has been, since early March for sure. This has been front and center in our daily lives. But I'd love to hear from your perspective, what you've seen in terms of the pandemic's effect on farming, the food industry, and the grain industry in particular.
Well, I think one of the things that I've observed that just really impresses me is what I would characterize as the flexible resilience. So in the beginning, if you can remember March, right, it feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
What we saw were early interruptions to just regular demand due to this immediate shutdown, whether it was a restaurant, a school, or another kind of institutional feeding place. That steady, reliable demand in food service just vanished overnight. And in the grain industry, we saw our bakers and millers adapt to that loss of food service customers, but they also simultaneously had to work to ensure food and worker safety, as well as shoring up their own supply chains so that they could ensure production continued. So while we saw some temporary factory closures, especially in the grain space, what was far more common was to see that production just shift to other facilities in order to maintain the supply. Mm-hmm. Another change we saw that goes back to this flexible resilience idea is in consumer purchasing. So we, and I say we here because I'm squarely in this camp as well, we stopped eating our sandwiches and pasta out, and we upped our purchases of packaged like bread and pasta and cereal. We've seen in the data just record purchases, even of flour for at-home baking, which had been on a very steady decline over the last decade. Accompanying this shift is where we purchase the product. So we saw a change in that perception as well. So recently, the foundation commissioned a national survey to better understand people's thinking about grain foods in this pandemic. One of the things we learned was that roughly a third of Americans not only took comfort in bread and pasta, but they also saw it as nutritious. And to your point about the low carb diets, I mean, that's a real pivot just in a short period of time of, 33% of Americans saying that their bread is providing them with nutrition. So I don't know if they're reading the labels or they're just realizing the satiety, and satisfaction that they get from the product as they eat their meals. But, it's a real difference from what we were hearing a couple of years ago about bread makes you fat. And if I eat bread, I have to go to the gym immediately. Those kinds of words.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting to see, and I've talked about this on previous podcast episodes with regard to like the initial panic buying and panic shopping and stocking the pantry and so on. But I believe it was March 12th is the day that I went to the store, my last quote unquote regular shopping trip where I thought, okay, I just got to pick up a few things before we have to start sheltering in place. And a huge overflowing grocery cart later. Yeah.
Right.
But one of the things that really surprised me is the pasta aisle was almost completely empty. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I already had a lot of pasta in my pantry, but I grabbed a few more boxes. But I thought, wow, that's just really interesting. And, we'd heard about the toilet paper and the water and such before that. But some of the reports were saying, well, the toilet paper, there's a lot of reasons, but maybe one reason is because it's so bulky, it's easy to make those shelves look bare by, taking the product off the shelves. And I think this speaks to some of what we're going to address as well, is that you've got product that goes to residential versus commercial. And there's kind of different products in some cases and also different end users. And it's hard to just shift where, okay, well, people are staying home, so they need more toilet paper at home. But we've been sending toilet paper for commercial use, and we can't just switch over and funnel that to residential. Can you speak to that with regard to, we saw some of these like food shortages, but they weren't really food shortages. And we can kind of speak to that.
Your parallel with what happened in toilet paper is spot on. Imagine in the morning you're stopping at your deli and grabbing your bagel with egg and cheese. I can guarantee you that deli received the bagel, the eggs, and the cheese in a very different format than what you or I would receive it in if we went to the grocery store and purchased those products. And so absolutely, that shift was a challenge. And so was there really a food shortage? The answer is yes and no. So in economics, we define a shortage as a condition that exists when the quantity demanded, bear with me, is greater than the quantity supplied at the market price. So that's exactly what happened as our willingness as a consumer to purchase flour or bread or any other household product. As that consumption dramatically changed, that was driven by us. That is a shortage. And shortages are these phenomena created by consumers, right? And they persist until production can be modified to meet the demand. So in purely academic terms, toilet paper, bread, pasta, there absolutely was a shortage. So in an uncertain time, I can guarantee you, all economists would agree that that was a shortage. Now, most people, colloquially, when we're speaking, don't necessarily use that academic definition for a shortage. So I also said yes and no. So despite what you saw on your shelves, right, the lack of toilet paper, the lack of bread, the lack of pasta, there was never a food shortage. We had never run out of the wheat to make the flour and the bread.
Right.
And it wasn't even a lack of capacity. We had the capacity. It just all had to be shifted over so that it could be sold at retail to us as consumers, because there are very few of us who want a 50-pound bag of flour.
Right. And that's, a lot of the updates I was hearing on some of the weekly webinars that I was attending. Like, you've got a huge bag of onions.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't even know the weight of it or whatever, but you can't repackage it up into smaller bags of onions for people. They can't do anything with all of that. So some of those logistics, right?
Yes. I use the 50-pound bag of flour, and it's the smallest bag. that's sold to food service. So, many of them are buying them and they're 100 pounds. And so, yes, the packaging was it was a challenge, but a surmountable challenge.
Mm-hmm. So what else with regard to bread, pasta, other grains? I mean, yeah, we weren't getting them out in restaurants, but certainly we were doing it more at home. We're having sandwiches at home. We're baking bread at home. We're making, a stock in our pantry with, dried pasta, which is very, obviously not perishable and shelf stable. And we want to have those comfort foods, but also, as you said, those foods that provide the nutrition we need as well.
Yes. So what we saw and we have continued to see is in March, you had grocery, you had sales up about 50%, depending on the product, okay, which is, as you can imagine, very dramatic. Pasta in particular is interesting because its consumption patterns actually decline as the weather gets warmer. Mm-hmm. So their increase in volume was counter-cyclical as well, which goes to why you may have seen a few more delays in getting pasta restocked on the shelves. And what we've seen throughout, the pandemic, so until today, is about 20 to 25% increase in retail sales of packaged bread products. And I think, that kind of shows you had the panic buying, the stock the pantry, we ate it down, and now we've restabilized. But it's still significant elevation. And one of the things I always point out to people is the 20 to 25% increase in sales of bread comes at a time when for the last 10 years, we have seen a steady decline in sales. Year over year, the number of packaged loaves of bread that consumers were buying has declined even as the population was going up. And so this increase is dramatic.
Wow. Any other learnings from the survey that you recently did that you want to share about kind of the shift in our behaviors?
Well, I think one of the interesting learnings was when we set out to do the survey, to be honest, we didn't really expect bread and pasta to register at all. When you start talking to people about comfort foods, you think of candy and chips and ice cream and, those types of foods. They definitely registered, right? Like those were ones. So when we found bread and pasta embedded in that, we knew like there was something really there. And I think kind of digging into that and understanding that they also viewed it as nutritious. And so in the moment of a pandemic, it's not, I had a bad day, let me eat a bowl of ice cream. Mm-hmm. It's, I have to persevere through this. And there's tremendous amounts of uncertainty, like about your job, about your children going to school, the health of the people in your family, like what's happening in your neighborhood. There's so many layers of uncertainty. And so finding a food that's comfortable and provides that comfort, it's affordable, and that has the added value of nutrition and everyone in the family will eat it. I think that's how we were able to find ourselves in that list of comfort foods. Those are some of the learnings from our survey.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you're saying that, it just sounds like so many of these things just lined up to lead to that. And yeah, it makes sense that outside of the pandemic, pre-pandemic, if you will, and that, oh yeah, I had a bad day or I want a treat, I'm going to have some ice cream, versus there's a lot going on. I need to take care of myself and I need to nourish myself and I need to get good sleep and I need to sort of be prepared to handle everything that's going on. It's kind of how I feel about it.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And I say that as it comes out of our survey, but it's also the experience we've been living in our home. It's that bread on the table kind of brings everyone together. So I have 3 kids and I try to fix one meal a night that we can all eat off of, but very rarely do all 5 of us eat all of it. Mm-hmm. And so bread at the table is the one kind of common ingredient that everyone can enjoy with their meal. And as a mom, it makes me feel good, right? Because I know everyone's going to leave the table full. That's important and satisfied. And we don't have to argue over, did you eat enough? Can you eat more? Or, those sorts of conversations.
Right. And just one more thing about how the comfort and nutrition aligned. You have a chart actually that I can put in the show notes at soundbitesrd.com and or, use in the social posts that really no other food sort of matched up with comfort and nutritious from my recollection looking at that chart.
Yes, that too was really interesting, right? I do hope you can put that in the show notes because I think it really showcases it clearly. But yes, that is very true.
It was really interesting. And, from a dietitian standpoint, really good to see and really encouraging. So let's talk a little bit about grain's journey from the field, harvesting, and everything involved to get to our homes.
Yeah, happy to. So wheat, which is the foundation of all the breadbasket products, it starts out in the field. And one thing I would just underscore here is that wheat is grown in 42 of our 50 states. So It is truly prolific. And from the fields, it has to be harvested, where then the farmer takes it to storage, often called a grain elevator or more commonly a silo amongst non-farmers. And so you'll see those dotting the country if you get out of town at all. If you live in Denver, you can see them from Denver. So that's a great location to see the big grain storage facilities there. But from there, it is then put on a train. Grain can be stored for a while. So it will sit in the elevator, then it will be loaded onto a train. Often these trains have 100 cars. So it's a significant amount of grain that gets moved at a time. And these trains then go to mills, where it is milled. And we have milling across the country as well. I'm going to pause here to just hope everyone's tracking with me. 42 states out of the country, mills across the country. Bread is a very local product. It was local before local was popular. And we're going to kind of continue that at the mill. Then it is milled, whether it's into an enriched flour or a whole grain flour, where it is then either put back on a train or a truck, as we referenced some of the bags, and where it is then taken to bakeries, where at the bakery, they have smaller storage capacities. Flour cannot be stored for as long, but it can be stored for a number of days. And so the flour is deposited into these, in-house silos at the bakeries, where it is then used in a finished product. And once the finished product is done, fresh bread does not last long. And so it is quickly put onto a truck and taken to your grocery store or bakery, where it oftentimes, like bakeries often deliver 5 days a week. And again, it's all about the freshness. So, making sure that that is fresh and on the shelf and ready for you to squeeze it and take it home. But fresh packaged bread often can't travel further than 150 miles. So you can be pretty certain when you're buying a packaged loaf of bread that that's a very local purchase.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, another myth busted.
Yeah. I mean, not that I thought of it as not being local, but I just never thought about bread being local, but that makes so much sense. Okay, so can you give us some kind of details or deep dive into how the pandemic impacted this journey that you just kind of shared with us? We already talked a little bit about this flexible resilience and a little bit about was it a shortage or not, but I'd love to hear more about the supply chain and how it has some flexibility, but some rigidity. I'd love for you to explain that.
Happy to. And as you pointed out, there are points of flexibility in the chain, and then there are points of rigidity. And it depends on the circumstance as to whether the flexibility is the strength or weakness, and vice versa on the rigidity piece. And in this particular situation with this pandemic, flexibility has proven to be critical. And so when you're looking to scale up production, especially for retail, which is what we're looking at, you have three obstacles that have to be overcome from the beginning. And the first one is workers. You have to guarantee that you have a safe and healthy workforce to run the trains and run the mills and run the bakeries as we go through that supply chain. You also have to maintain that access to transportation. So as we were talking before, we use trucks and trains and all kinds of modes of transportation to move this product around. And so you have to make sure that you have the trains coming in and the trucks going out to make sure that the product gets delivered. And then, as we also have talked about, packaging is critically important. And retail is basically the smallest form of packaging that's out there. And so you have to not only have the packaging in-house, but you have to have the equipment to package. And you package 8 hamburger buns very differently than you do 24 or 48. And so companies had to work through those. So any firm, whether it's a bakery or a farmer or a grocery store, had to ensure the safety of their workforce. And like I said, they also had to ensure that they had the transportation kind of coming in and going out. And I know I talked to a Durham miller, so he mills for pasta. And one of the first things he had to do was secure the trains to come in and to go out because trains are booked, months, if not years in advance.
Wow.
To move these types of commodities. And as I said earlier, pasta is counter-cyclical, right? So our consumption goes down as the weather goes up. So these trains were not on the books. And one of the things that happened was retail, right? Just regular shopping, think your Target, right? Was declining, which freed up trucks. So our Durham millers could get access to rail transportation that might have otherwise been very difficult. So I know it was difficult not going to Target, but the food supply chain thanks you because it freed up rail cars for them. So the workers, the transportation, and like I said, the packaging were all really, really important. And I think if those were your only obstacles, you found success pretty quickly, right? Now, for other parts of agriculture where there's more consolidation and more rigidity to the way it's structured, I think that's where you saw a lot of disruption, negative disruption. So think meat, dairy, eggs. In those spaces, we saw production facility shutdowns because they had this consolidated food manufacturing sector. I know it was definitely in the news, so many of your listeners have probably already heard about it. But you also had the consumer demand for those types of products is also very different. So think about like your local McDonald's or your local school district. And you saw dairy farmers dumping product. And the reason that you saw that in dairy, but you didn't see it in grains, is because dairy farmers simply did not have the ability to adapt to the change in customers.
That quickly, right?
Yeah, that quickly. Like it just proved to be too long and too difficult of a process. And so they chose to dump, which is obviously very disappointing. It's a reflection, like I said, on the rigidity of that supply chain, but it wasn't an irrational decision by those dairy farmers.
Yeah, sad. And certain components or categories within the food supply chain weren't able to pivot as quickly. But it sounds like from what you're saying, a lot of the food industry, they were scrambling for some solutions and really came up with some creative solutions in order to make that shift. I wanted to ask you, kind of getting back to grain's journey from field to table, how does today's wheat or grain compare to that of the past? Sometimes we hear that it's changed, that it's different. I'd love for you to speak to that.
I love this question because this is a non-pandemic question, but a very, very important one. Many of your listeners may have heard, right, that wheat has been modified and it's not the same. These sorts of myths are pervasive, and they're ones that we really work to counter because what we know is that the wheat today versus the wheat grown 150 years ago is exactly the same. So while we do notice some variance based on local soil minerality, right? So that is true. The nutritional value of wheat remains unchanged, and it has, like I said, for centuries. Now, I can assert this very authoritatively because we know it from numerous studies. There are folks in Canada and all over Europe who have access to seed banks. And what they've done is they've gone back and they've grown wheat seeds that were 150 years old and up to the modern seed. And they've compared the nutritional values of the product and then published it in these scientific peer-reviewed journals articles. And they have consistently found that there is no difference in the nutritional value of wheat, no matter how old the seed. The plant that is produced renders the same nutrition. If not exactly the same, the modern is better than the older wheat. And so we're very confident that while that rumor or myth is out there, it is not true. Absolutely not true.
Yeah, thank you for clearing that up. I attended a really fascinating presentation about this at Fancy last year, I believe. And it got into all the different kinds of wheat, and it was quite technical, but I know that we hear this from time to time. And so I'm glad you cleared that up for us. And it makes me think of, again, back to those empty pasta shelves on that last normal, quote unquote, shopping trip that I took, which was anything but normal. Some of my dietitian colleagues were maybe being a little snarky on social media about, well, I guess the gluten-free craze is over, and it's interesting, I do think that, and I say this on the podcast more recently, is that hopefully some of the pandemic impacts will help us maybe have a more meaningful conversation about food. And not worry, as I've kind of created this triplet phrase like processed, paleo, and pesticides. Like, can we talk about something a little bit more, more meaningful? And if somebody doesn't have gluten intolerance, then enjoy your gluten, I guess is how I would say that. What about the potential long-term impacts? Obviously, there's so much that we don't know. But from your perspective, again, with your global agriculture knowledge and experience, in looking forward post-pandemic, or, maybe that's a long time coming, who knows? I would love to hear your thoughts on these potential long-term impacts, like on grocery shopping. We talked a little bit about, everybody making bread at home, but any other implications, and also farming and agriculture in general, what you would like our listeners to know.
So we know that the pandemic is going to have long-term impacts on all of us. But I'm not a believer that our lives are totally changed. The pandemic of 1918 was followed by the Roaring 20s. So, I think as humans, we always want to go back to what we know and what is comfortable. I know we're all probably looking forward to that, especially right now on a summer day.
Yeah.
But in terms of agriculture, in terms of food, there are going to be changes. Absolutely. And I think one that's really easy to point to is grocery shopping. And so what we have seen is that prior to COVID-19, about 10 to 15%, depending on the grocery store chain, 10 to 15% of the store's shopping was done online. And there was a real barrier to new entrants to that space. People just liked going to the store. It was part of their routine. They were adverse to the technology, whatever the reason was. But what we've seen is COVID-19 has obliterated any of those challenges, right? And we've seen a dramatic increase in online shopping and curbside pickup. And I think once you break through those challenges and people realize all of the niceness that goes along with that, we're going to continue to see those numbers stay high. Anecdotally, I can just always share, I have a mother who's in her early 70s and, like I said, grew up on a farm, but she loved going to the store. Going to the store was just part of her routine. And she really thought online shopping was just for busy people like her daughter, right? And now that's what she does. And she likes it.
Yeah.
She really likes it. It's so convenient. They carry her groceries to her car. They put them in her trunk for her.
Wow.
She really loves all of that. And I think when things start to relax and my mom has the option to go to the store again every week, my guess is she does go back, just not as often. And she starts relying on that online shopping. And if you can have a breakthrough with the folks that are over the age of 70, you can only imagine the trickle-down effects across the other generations who are more open to that technology. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that.
I completely agree. And it's funny because I have the same situation with my mother in her early 70s. And I know that we've seen this. This is also another example of how the food supply chain had a little trouble pivoting because online grocery shopping was just such a small segment of the business. And then it just literally flip-flopped overnight. And the older generation who had very little interest or incentive to use it really relied on it. And to your point, once they break through that barrier, and I've shared this on the show before, even myself, I had never ordered groceries online before, and I had to sit down and figure it out and do it, which I just never wanted to spend the time to do before. It was just easier to go to the store. And to your point, like my mom also in her early 70s, she loves it. And she will go back at some point, but it'll be a hybrid of both, I think.
Yeah, I really think that will be one of the biggest changes for grocery coming out of this.
What else?
So I think some of the other long-term impacts that we are going to see is introduction to new products. So, for example, in home baking. So while I know that sourdough bread is filling up your Instagram feed, what we know from sales data is that mixes have been just flying off the shelves. Some of their purchase numbers are up 150%. And one of the things that category had really been struggling, there had been a tremendous amount of innovation in the space, introducing new flavors, new methods, new products, tons of innovation and excitement that the consumer was just not interested in. And I think with the pandemic, what we've seen is people are trying these new products. And so I think you will see home baking and mixes come back in and stay. I think they will stick around for a while because people have identified the innovations that have happened and they see how they can fit into their life. And it's the bridge, right? A mix helps you get that home baked feel and smell in your house without necessarily all of the labor of doing it from scratch. So I think that's another one. And then I just think one of the things we've all had to really be mindful about is what we eat. And one of the things we're really hopeful for at the Grain Foods Foundation is that understanding kind of how to really build a nutritious diet that works for you. And to your point about gluten, I think hopefully for those who don't have a condition that necessitates it, other people have had their eyes open to the healthfulness, the versatility that it can provide to a healthful diet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always come back to the fact that I'm the Guiltfree RD because food shouldn't make you feel bad. And I want people to choose nutrient-rich foods. Try to get as much nutrition out of your food and enjoy your food with health in mind. And, I think something like grains, breads, pastas, and so on are really, like you said, the foundation to a healthy diet and that versatility. And it's something that's affordable and you can get good nutrition and eat healthy on a budget when you have these types of foods in your diet.
Absolutely. And I will just share anecdotally for me, we've seen a rebirth in my house of the half sandwich, the one piece of bread with a little bit of ham. It's way tastier than a bar. And, it's easy to make. There isn't a lot of mess or cleanup associated with it. Even, my 7-year-old can make that happen for himself. So yes.
It's funny you say that because that's kind of like my go-to is that half sandwich thing. And part of that is my age and I don't need as many calories as I used to. And so I'm, nothing wrong with a full sandwich for my kids, but I'm doing the half sandwich thing. And typically, we always have bread on hand. It's usually more of a breakfast thing for us because I work from home, but my husband doesn't and my kids are gone or whatever. So we don't typically, have lunch and do sandwiches, but now, during this quarantining shelter in place. Yeah. So we've been doing a lot of sandwiches, whether it's peanut butter, lunch meat, leftover chicken breast, anything. So we've been doing that a lot. And it's funny, you also said about how cyclically pasta sales would go down as the warmer weather, which makes sense. We're grilling out and, I'm sure hamburger buns and hot dog buns go up during the warm weather versus, the colder weather. But don't forget about those pasta salads, people. I just made a pasta salad for Father's Day weekend. We did some grilling out and I made a pasta salad and, we're making our Instant Pot mac and cheese later today. So we still have actually been making a lot of cold weather things during the summer because it's like, the slow cooker, the Instant Pot, things like that. It's just easier to make a bunch of food and then pack it into the freezer or whatever. But yeah. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share with regard to the grains journey and the impact that COVID-19 has had on the farming, the grain industry, any of our shopping habits, anything that you've shared? Is there anything else that you want us to know?
I just want to say thank you. Thank you for folks being curious about it. If they ever want to learn more, let me know. I'm happy to field any questions or have a conversation. But as someone who kind of fell in love with agriculture when I was 18 years old, I think it's really, really an amazing field. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement in agriculture, but there's a lot of really great stuff being done as well and up and down that supply chain. So thank you for being curious. And remember that grains are the foods we love that love us back.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Well, and I know I was going to ask you, so I don't want to forget that you are doing a lot of work right now focusing on the dietary guidelines. So do you want to share a little sneak peek with us about what that entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have been, and the Grain Foods Foundation has always worked very closely with the dietary guidelines process. And right now they have convened a scientific panel that's reviewing the literature and preparing to put out their recommendations. And a couple of weeks ago, they had a meeting where they were discussing their draft recommendations. So these are still subject to change. But the indication was that the science is really firm around carbohydrates and specifically around grains. And so we expect that the number of servings recommended by the dietary guidelines will stay at 6. And we also expect that the recommendation will remain make half your grains whole. And I think that's one of the important things for folks. It's, definitely don't lose sight of the whole grains. They are vitally important because not only do they provide the nutrients of enriched grains, but, you have the antioxidants and some other benefits of eating them. But your enriched grains are your other half. And I guess I would just encourage folks to recognize that enriched grain products are incredibly nutritious and have been serving to keep Americans healthy now for generations. So look for that enriched grain label on there. That's nothing to be afraid of. That's something that you should embrace. And then, always think about staples versus indulgences and try to strike a smart balance.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up because that reminds me that I have had two of the experts on your Grain Foods Foundation advisory panel on the podcast in the past, and we've touched on some of that research about enriched grains and nutrient-rich versus more of the indulgent grains. So I will link to those in the show notes at soundbitesrd.com, but I'll just give a quick shout out. The most recent one was podcast episode 120 called Refined Grains and Diabetes, Guilt by Association, ? With Dr. Glenn Gazer. And the other one is podcast episode 94, The Whole Truth About Grains with Dr. Julie Miller-Jones. And I have to say, this is the truth. That episode is by far off the charts, my most popular episode. And I couldn't be more excited about that. It's a long episode. Dr. Julie Miller-Jones is amazing. And I even have this little, it was supposed to be a short little outro at the end where we touched on a couple of things I had forgot to ask her during the interview. And it turned out to be almost like a 30-minute chemistry lesson. But anyway, she did a great job of explaining things. And both of those episodes are currently being submitted for free continuing education credits for dietitians and dietetic technicians. So I'm glad you brought that up so I could share that information.
Julie is just a wealth of knowledge. And I have enjoyed every encounter I've ever had with her, but there was one that really stands out. I had the pleasure of visiting a facility in Mexico City or just outside of Mexico City called Cimet. And they have a large seed bank there. And it's where there's a tremendous amount of wheat research that goes on. And I got to visit that facility with her. So you can only imagine being in the depths of a seed bank with Julie and listening to her questions were smarter than anything I could think of. So
yeah,
it
she's
was a
amazing.
tremendous learning experience.
Yeah. Every time I talk with her or listen to her, hear her speak, I learned so much. She's amazing. So
yes.
Well, thank you. And I also wanted to mention that people can find out more information at grainfoodsfoundation.org and follow y'all on social media, and I'll have all the links in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com, but people can just go to grainfoodsfoundation.org and find you through there. But thank you so much for coming on the show again, Christine. This was really interesting.
Yes, thank you, Melissa. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, and for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.